The contact window opened at 6:14 station time, and I had spent 12 years preparing for it. My station was a secondary observer post on the port side of the unbroken mandate S command tier, close enough to the flag bridge to hear Admiral Chance's orders through the bulkhead, far enough that no one expected me to give any. That suited me. I was the diplomatic liaison, which in practice meant I was the only person aboard who could recite all 47 movements of the Soral Convocation's first contact liturgy from memory. I had learned them in the order they were performed, and I had learned the count responses a receiving civilization was expected to make, and I had rehearsed those responses until they came without hesitation in 3 of the convocation's major tonal registers. I had been doing this since I was 26. I was 38 now, and I still wasn't sure I had the 5th harmonic quite right. The unbroken mandate was holding in the shadow of Rehearsed, a gas giant the color of old brass with a storm system large enough to swallow 3 Earths. We had been there for 19 hours. The carrier was running quiet, no active sensors, transponder on minimal ping only. Alongside us in the dark sat prevailing wind and constant shore 2 Acheron-class frigates whose weapon systems I had been asked, politely and only once, not to reference in any communication with the convocation. At 6:12, I had my console open to the dossier I had been building since my posting. 47 movements, 312 years of rehearsal on the convocation's end. That was the figure their own records gave, the ones that had reached us through the Cathara intermediaries 11 years ago. 312 years of preparation for this moment. They had built choirships specifically for the liturgy. They had trained successive generations of recitants. They had geometric formations that took a decade each to master, and were used for nothing except the approach sequence to a new civilization's representatives. I found that neither moving nor absurd. It was simply what they were. I had spent 12 years learning to meet them on their own terms, and I believed that was the correct approach. I still believed it at 6:13. At 0614:08, the Soral Convocation arrived. They came out of their approach vector in formation, and I had seen the formation diagram so many times in my dossier that for a moment the sight of it live on the sensor return felt like a confirmation rather than a revelation. 17 vessels. The Grand Recitant's flagship at center, a long, organic-looking hull, smooth in a way that always read to human sensors as biological, though the Cathara had told us it wasn't. 8 choirships flanking it in the primary lattice arrangement, their tonal emitters already cycling. 4 status vessels at the corners of the outer formation, broadcasting their positional codes, the convocation's equivalent of displaying rank and intent simultaneously. And 4 approach heralds at the leading edge, smaller ships that existed for no purpose except to arrive first and announce the liturgy's beginning. The tonal transmission hit our receivers at 0614:22. I heard it on my station speaker, a sound that is genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't spent time with Soral acoustic data. Not music exactly, not language exactly. The closest I had ever come to explaining it was, imagine a cathedral deciding to speak. Movement 1. The acknowledgement of void. This was the opening of the liturgy, the part where the convocation formally recognized that they were entering space not their own and declared their intent peaceable. It lasted, according to the texts, 11 minutes. I had the counter response prepared. I had it phonetically transcribed into a prompt system that would feed it to our own tonal transmitter in the correct register. My hand was on the confirm key. I was waiting for the flag bridge to authorize the response. I waited through movement 1. Nothing came from the flag bridge. At 0625:41, movement 1 concluded. There was a pause of 44 seconds, the liturgical silence, which the texts described as a space for the receiving civilization to offer its first response. Our transponder pinged. The standard navigational identification ping, the kind any vessel broadcasts automatically every 90 seconds in a contact corridor. It had not been sent deliberately. It had simply pinged because that was what it did. The convocation's formation held. I pulled up the flag bridge feed on my secondary screen. Admiral Chance was at the center console, arms folded, watching the sensor returns with the expression he used when he was reading a technical report he found neither alarming nor particularly interesting. He had not looked at the diplomatic station feed once. His flag captain was standing to his right, and they were speaking in low voices about something I couldn't hear clearly. I caught the words fuel consumption and *Verath-Solan's orbital period *, which suggested they were discussing logistics. The convocation began movement 2. The declaration of form, this was the part where the convocation formally identified itself, its lineage, its authority structure, its reason for seeking contact. It was the longest movement, running to 23 minutes in the full rendering. It was also, in the convocation's own doctrinal texts, the movement during which the receiving civilization was expected to begin its own responsive declaration, a parallel transmission establishing its identity and purpose. Our tonal transmitter remained silent. At 6:31 I sent a priority message to the flag bridge. Convocation is in movement 2. Counter-declaration window is open, awaiting authorization to transmit. Admiral Chance's reply came at 6:33, acknowledged, hold. I stared at the word for a moment, then I looked back at my sensor feed. The choir ships were still transmitting. The tonal output was extraordinary. I had the acoustic analysis running, and the harmonic complexity was everything the Kethara texts had promised. 3 centuries of refinement. They had made something genuinely beautiful, in the way that very serious effort toward a very serious purpose can produce something beautiful even when beauty wasn't the goal. The unbroken mandate held position. Its active systems remained at the same minimal level they had been at since we took station in Verath-Solan's shadow. The 2 frigates likewise. We were 3 ships against 17, but the convocation's formation geometry was not a combat geometry. I knew every combat configuration the Kethara texts documented, and this wasn't one. This was the liturgical array, purely. Movement 2 ended at 6:48, 44 seconds silence. Our transponder pinged. I had by this point stopped waiting for authorization. I was watching the convocation's formation with a specific attention, the kind that comes from knowing the texts well enough to read the behavior rather than just the transmissions. And I was seeing something the texts did not have a movement for. The approach heralds had adjusted their position, marginally, a shift of perhaps 2 degrees in their relative bearing to the flagship. In the liturgical geometry, that shift was the equivalent of a note held a fraction too long. It meant something. In the texts, there was a passage about the approach herald's role as formation anchors, and a footnote about what it signified when an anchor ship moved outside its assigned position. The footnote used a word in the Soral tonal language that the Kethara had translated as *recalibration, and had noted, in a parenthetical, that it had no exact parallel in any human language they were aware of, but the nearest approximation was something like the process of adjusting an assumption that had previously seemed too basic to examine. The convocation began movement 3, the offer of standing, formally extending recognition to the receiving civilization as a peer entity within the convocation's cosmological framework. It was the movement that mattered most, theologically. It was the one you were not supposed to reach without a receiving response already established. They transmitted it anyway. I understood then that they didn't know what else to do. They had prepared for every variation of a response. They had, presumably, prepared for a hostile response, and for silence as hostility, and for technical failure in the receiving vessel's communication systems. What they had not prepared for was a receiving vessel that was simply and entirely present, stable, non-threatening, clearly functional, and making no response whatsoever beyond the periodic transponder ping that was so automatic it barely counted as communication. They had 3 centuries of liturgy, and no rubric for asterisk nothing in particular. I sent a second message to the flag bridge at 6:57. Convocation is in movement 3. This is atypical. They are proceeding without a receiving response. Recommend we at minimum transmit the standard hailing identifier. Admiral Chance came on the channel this time. His voice was what it always was, even direct, containing no particular tension. COS, how are they positioned? Combat geometry. No, sir, full liturgical array. No weapon signatures on any vessel. Any indication they're about to change that? I looked at the approach heralds. The anchor ships had shifted again. The same marginal bearing adjustment, but now across all 4 simultaneously. The notation in the texts was unambiguous. When all 4 anchors recalibrated in concert, it was a formation-level event, not a navigational correction. I had a word for what I thought was happening, and it was not a word the Admiral would find useful. No, sir, I said. No indication of a change to hostile geometry. Then we hold, he said, and the channel closed. I held. We held. The asterisk unbroken mandate held, and prevailing wind held, and constant shore held, and the transponder pinged every 90 seconds with the patient indifference of a machine doing what it was built to do. Movement 3 ended at 7:11. There was no 44-second silence. The convocation's formation was moving, not the liturgical adjustments I had been tracking, but an actual, committed positional change. The approach heralds were pulling back toward the flagship. The status vessels were collapsing their outer positions. The choir ships had cut their tonal transmission mid-sequence. I had never read anywhere in the texts about what it looked like when a convocation liturgy was interrupted from within. I was watching it now. It was very quiet. At 7:14, the Grand Recitant's flagship transmitted a short tonal sequence. Not a movement, not a formal element. The acoustic analysis flagged it as outside the known liturgical parameters entirely. A frequency range the convocation used for internal communication between recitants rather than for external broadcast. I had access to a partial glossary of those frequencies, and I sat very still while the translation system worked through it. It came back after 4 minutes. The confidence rating was 61%, which for tonal-to-language translation is about as good as it gets. The translation read, "The expected form is not present. The receiving party holds without form. Assemble for recalibration." The convocation's formation completed its withdrawal geometry at 7:19. At 7:21, the approach heralds jumped out of the corridor entirely. By 7:24, the last of the 17 vessels had gone. The contact corridor was empty except for us, and the slow gold light of Verath Solans reflected radiation. At 7:26, Admiral Chance's voice came over the general ship channel, not the diplomatic feed, the general channel, the one the engineering crew heard and the mess hall heard and the junior watch officers heard while they were doing mundane things in corridor C7. His voice was the same as it always was. Navigation, log the Verath Solan contact corridor as cleared. Tactical, stand down from minimal active. Helm, take us out of shadow at standard transit speed. Next waypoint is Cedral Station. That was all. I sat in my secondary observer post and looked at my console. The dossier was still open, 47 movements, the full phonetic transcriptions, the counter-response sequences I had rehearsed until the 5th harmonic was almost right. 12 years of preparation for a conversation that had never started. Except that wasn't accurate, and I knew it wasn't accurate even before I could articulate why. The convocation had arrived with 3 centuries of apparatus for the moment of being seen, and we had simply been present while they performed it, and the gap between what they expected a receiving civilization to do and what we had done was so complete that their own formation anchors couldn't hold position. We hadn't refused their liturgy. We hadn't countered it or dismissed it or failed to understand it. We had just been there, stable, non-hostile, entirely ourselves. And the weight of that ordinariness had been enough to break a ceremony 300 years in the making. I thought about the translation. The receiving party holds without form. That was what we were, seen from the outside. A thing that held without form. No ceremony, no apparatus, no performance of what first contact was supposed to look like. Just the ships and the transponder and the admiral talking to his flag captain about fuel consumption. I didn't know what the convocation would do with its recalibration. I didn't know if we would meet them again in the corridor, or in some other configuration, or not for another generation. What I knew was that the moment they had been building toward for 3 centuries had happened, and it had happened on terms they had no category for, and the universe they went home to was a different shape than the one they had left. I closed the dossier. I didn't delete it. You don't delete 12 years of work. But I closed it, and I sat back, and I looked out the port observation glass at Verath Solin's slow amber light, and I thought that perhaps the most human thing we had ever done in that corridor was also the thing we had done least deliberately. We had simply declined to perform. And it had been enough.